It's a little talked about subject, but as long as men have been sailing the world's oceans, the sailors sometimes had to resort to survival cannibalism. This was known as the custom of the sea. Men of the sea were often cast adrift in open boats, marooned on remote islands, and driven half mad with starvation and acting on the most basic instinct to survive. This was the age when voyages would last years. There was no satellite or GPS positioning, just the scale of the marina. So here we look at 5 notorious stories of maritime survival. We are really proud to announce that this video has been sponsored by the absolutely terrific World of Warships Blitz game. With its top-of-the-line graphics, this high-energy game is jam-packed full of action. Not only is this one of the most realistic games of this type we have ever played, it also costs nothing to play. So, you can easily download it from Google Play or the App Store and get playing within seconds. Enjoy real dynamic backgrounds and test your strategic skill at gameplay. Don't waste another minute. Install World of Warships Blitz using the link in the description below. What's more, if you're a first-time player and manage to reach level 3, you'll get a free Tier 3 USS South Carolina battleship. This is an added bonus, especially for our viewers, and it's an awesome battleship. Happy playing, and don't forget to tell your friends and get them involved. The Nottingham Galley, 1710. On December the 11th, 1710, the Nottingham Galley was just a day's sail from its destination of Boston, on the east coast of the USA, when Captain John Dean and his crew were caught in a fierce winter storm. The ship was carrying butter, cheeses, and cordage rope from England when it shipwrecked onto a barren spit of land called Boone Island. The small rocky island off the coast of York, Maine, was just 15 feet above sea level and was unable to sustain life. The 14-man crew huddled together under a piece of old sailcloth, trying to keep warm in the freezing temperatures. They had managed to salvage some fresh water and cheese, but they were unable to make a fire, so they clung to life eating raw mussels and the odd seagull. Agonizingly, the crew could see smoke 6 miles away on the mainland, but no one knew they were there. The first person to die was the badly injured ship's cook, and although the unthinkable must have crossed their minds, they cast his body into the sea. A further 2 crewmen lost their lives after a failed attempt to get off the island on a makeshift raft. It was several days later that the ship's carpenter died of his injuries, and it was after his death that the starving men knew he had to be eaten. But the crew were unable to cut up what they saw as one of their own, so they begged the captain to do the butchery. Captain Dean first cut the head, hands, and feet from the corpse to try and somehow dehumanize the body. He then cut the flesh into small equal portions, washed it in the seawater, and issued it amongst the crew. The captain encouraged the men to eat rockweed with each mouthful. With no fire, the human meat was eaten raw. This terrible act sustained the captain and what was left of the crew until their eventual rescue. Unbeknown to the men, the raft from the failed attempt to get off the island had washed up on the nearby mainland and prompted a search. The Peggy, 1765. In 1765, the Peggy had sailed from New York to the Azores to unload its cargo. After filling her holds with wine and brandy, she set sail for the return journey home. For over a month, the Peggy and her crew endured fierce gales and giant waves. The ship had been badly damaged from the relentless pounding and was taking on water, and with no steering was blown miles off course. After 5 weeks at sea, drifting in the open Atlantic Ocean, Captain David Harrison could only despair as the food and fresh water began to run out. The crew worked feverishly to keep the ship afloat, but were beginning to starve, and in their description, the crew began to defy their captain and started to drink the wine and brandy on board. Fueled by the alcohol, the crew burst into the captain's cabin and informed him that they were going to kill and eat a slave boy on board. At this stage, the captain was incapacitated and suffering from illness, starvation, and gout. He pleaded with his men not to go through with it, but the craved, ravenous crew paid no attention and set upon the slave, killing him and carving up his body, roasting his organs, then eating his flesh and limbs. Although this held the men's hunger for a while, thoughts soon turned to who they would kill and eat next. And in line with maritime tradition, lots were drawn. The name of each crew member was placed on a slip of paper and put into a hat, and the unfortunate crew member drawn was the foremaster man named David Flatt. He was to be killed and eaten the next morning. Luckily for him, the following morning the crew spotted a ship. It headed for them, and their ordeal was over. However, despite David Flatt's stay of execution, the terror of what was about to happen to him drove him to complete madness. The Pali, 1811. In 1811, another American ship, the Pali, had left Boston bound for the Caribbean with a cargo of lumber and salted meat. 3 days out, a severe storm broke off its masts and capsized the ship, and although the ship rolled back onto an even keel, the hull was completely waterlogged. 1 man was lost during the storm, and the other 6 survivors salvaged as much of the salted meat as they could. After 40 days drifting in the huge Atlantic Ocean, the meat and fresh water ran out. This forced the crew to eat barnacles and boiled salt water, using captured condensation as drinking water. Gradually, one by one, men began to die from hunger and exposure. But rather than eat the flesh of their fellow crewmen, the surviving men used their bodies as bait to catch sharks. Remarkably, 2 of the crew managed to survive an incredible 141 days before being rescued by the British ship Fame. The Essex, 1890 to 1820. In 1890, the Quaker-owned whaling ship Essex left Nantucket, a small island off Cape Cod on the eastern side of America. The ship's voyage was to take them into the southern Atlantic around Cape Horn and into the vast Pacific Ocean. And the voyage was to become one of the most infamous and dramatic maritime stories of all time. Captain George Pollard Jr. and his crew were set out to hunt and kill sperm whales, mostly for their valuable oil. But it was 3 months before they killed their first whale, and then a further month to round Cape Horn into the Pacific. The hunting had been good, and by November they had about 96 barrels of whale oil on board. As the new year of 1820 dawned, they pushed further out into the Pacific. Then on November the 20th, one of the most extraordinary and unheard of events happened. A vengeful 80-ton sperm whale set his sights on the Essex, and in an unprecedented move, it rammed the ship. The huge whale twice smashed into the side of the ship, causing damage to the oak planking. The ship quickly took on water and started to sink slowly. The crew in the surrounding small whaleboats looked on in horror as their mothership sank. Now adrift in the vast ocean, the 3 small whaleboats now had nowhere to land. The crew rigged up sails in a desperate attempt to sail east. In total, there were 20 survivors, and they had minimal amounts of fresh water and hardly any food. After 3 weeks adrift, they landed on a barren, unpopulated island called Henderson Island. They had drifted south rather than east. Unable to sustain themselves, 16 of the 19 surviving crew members decided to cast off again and tried to head east to reach the South American coast. The remaining 3 stayed on the island. As the new year arrived, the 3 small boats battled on through fierce rainstorms, and one of the boats became separated from the others. The situation was now desperate, and one by one the crew started to die of starvation. Second mate Matthew Joy was the first to die, following days later by sailor Richard Peterson. Both bodies were slipped over the side for a burial at sea. These were followed by Lawson Thomas and Charles Shorter. At this point, the crew knew they had to eat the dead men in order to survive. However, men that had died of starvation had little fat and muscle left on their bodies, so their corpses were cut up and the liver, heart and kidneys were removed and cooked using a flat stone fire. In total, 7 crewmen were chopped up and eaten. 6 of them had died of starvation. The 7th sailor, Owen Coffin, was the unfortunate one who drew the short straw and was killed to be eaten. By now, all 3 whaleboats had become separated. One of them was never seen again, the other 2 were rescued. The first was picked up by British merchant ship, the Indian. The British captain of the Indian described the 3 near skeletons he picked up as a deplorable and affecting picture of misery. 5 days later, Captain Pollard and sailor Charles Ramsdell were picked up by the whaling ship, the Dauphin. It was said that the ship's crew were greeted with the horrific sight of the 2 men surrounded by human bones who were still sucking the marrow from the bones of their dead shipmates. They had sailed an incredible 4,500 nautical miles across the Pacific. Later, a ship was sent to Henderson Island, and the 3 marooned sailors, close to death, were rescued. Many months later, a whaleboat was discovered, washed up on a tiny island called Ducie Island. Inside were 3 skeletons. This ghostly vessel was believed to be the lost Essex whaleboat. This incredible story was to become the inspiration for Herman Melville's 19th century classic novel Moby Dick, and has recently been brought to the big screen in a Ron Howard film called In the Heart of the Sea. The Mignonette, 1884. In Victorian England in the spring of 1884, a wealthy Australian man by the name of Jack Want bought himself an inshore yacht called the Mignonette. Want then hired an experienced seaman by the name of Tom Dudley to sail the yacht back to Australia for him. Dudley chose 3 other crew members to help him. They were Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old boy called Richard Parker, and they set sail from Southampton on the 19th of May 1884. After 2 months of steady sailing, the Mignonette ran into a storm just off the African coast. She was unable to handle the high seas and was soon overpowered by the towering waves. Knowing she was about to sink, the 4 crew members scrambled into a small wooden lifeboat dinghy, grabbing what provisions they could. After riding out the storm, the men were adrift with very little water and no materials for fishing. Their fight for survival had begun. The men did manage to find and kill a turtle, but as the weeks went by, their situation was becoming critical. With barely any drinking water, they began to drink their own urine. The young cabin boy, Parker, had made himself very sick from drinking seawater. Delirious and close to death, 2 of the crew decided to help him on his way so they could feed on his body. Dudley and Stevens undertook the task, as Brooks wanted no part in the killing watched on. The desperate crew set about cutting up the body, drinking the boy's blood, and eating his heart, liver, and innards while they were still warm. 4 days later, a German ship sailing from South America spotted the dinghy and pulled alongside, rescuing the 3 remaining crew and a half-consumed corpse. The men had been adrift for 24 days, and their ordeal was finally over. Well, almost. On their return to England, the 3 men explained what had happened and the measures they took to survive. The harbouring commissioners, while sympathetic to their plight, instructed the police to arrest them, because although survival cannibalism was not against the law, murder most definitely was. The 3 men were put on trial in the city of Exeter. Edmund Brooks was soon to be acquitted, as he had taken no part in the actual killing, and he, along with the captain of the German ship that had rescued them, became the main witnesses for the prosecution. Dudley and Stevens were found guilty of the murder of Richard Parker. They were sentenced to hang. However, after many appeals, this was eventually commuted to 6 months imprisonment. So that's 5 unbelievable survival at sea stories. Don't forget to check out today's sponsor, World of Warships Blitz. It's an awesome game for on the go, and is free. Click on the links in the description or in the comments to get started. And don't forget to reach level 3, so you can get the Tier 3 USS South Carolina Battleship. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.